My name is Olivia Hartman. I am 34, and on the night my sister married in a ballroom dripping with gold, the doors burst open. Strangers strode in shouting that my father owed $50,000. Laughter stopped, glasses froze, and then they lifted a contract with my name scrawled across it, binding me to a debt I never signed. In that instant, the fairy tale wedding shattered, and every eye in the room turned on me. I stepped into Rosewood Manor with Lucas at my side, the scent of lilies and polished wood filling the air. The chandeliers blazed above, casting golden light across a ballroom, dressed like something from a royal magazine spread. The string quartet played softly, each note weaving into the steady hum of laughter and glasses clinking. For a moment, I almost let myself believe I was simply another guest, but that hope vanished as quickly as it came. A hostess greeted us with a practiced smile and checked our names on a small card. Her tone was polite, but there was a flicker of hesitation before she gestured toward the farthest corner of the room. Lucas and I followed, weaving through clusters of guests who barely noticed us. The table was tucked near the service doors, where waiters slipped in and out carrying trays. The tablecloth was slightly wrinkled, the centerpiece wilted compared to the towering arrangements at the other tables. Behind me, dishes clattered in the kitchen. My chest tightened. I had known I would be placed out of sight, but the reality still stung. Across the ballroom, my mother Evelyn glowed in a silver gown, pearls at her throat. Her smile warm for everyone but me. She stood in the center of a circle of guests, her hand resting lightly on a man's arm. I watched her lips form the words with clarity, even across the room. Emily is our only pride and joy. My face flushed hot. She did not glance toward me. She did not even acknowledge that I existed. Emily swept past in a gown of hand-stitched lace, the veil catching the light as if she were wrapped in fire. For a moment I could not look away. She was breathtaking. She turned her head in my direction, but her eyes slid over me like I was part of the wall. No smile, no nod, nothing to say she knew me. Then she melted into her bridesmaids, their laughter bubbling like champagne. I caught sight of Hannah, the girl who had once been my closest friend. She stood among the bridesmaids in lavender satin, her hair pinned in a perfect knot. Her eyes found mine, held for a fraction of a second, then darted away as she leaned in to whisper something to another girl. They laughed, and my stomach dropped as if the floor beneath me had shifted. Lucas pulled out my chair and gave my hand a squeeze. His eyes said what his voice did not. He saw me. He knew. I managed a small smile and sank into the chair. The corner felt colder than the rest of the room, the warmth of the celebration stopping short of reaching us. Guests strolled by, their perfumes trailing, their laughter spilling, but none paused at our table. I watched as servers poured wine at the front tables, glasses filled to the brim, baskets of fresh bread set beside butter carved into roses. At our table, nothing arrived. Only the smell of roasted garlic drifting from the kitchen and the scrape of trays through swinging doors. I stared at the bare setting in front of me and felt 10 years old again, waiting for a ride that never came. At the head table, my father, Richard, looked every bit the respected patriarch. His tuxedo was flawless, his smile broad, his hand shaken again and again by men in dark suits. He radiated confidence, the image of a man adored by his family. Then his gaze swept across the room and landed on me. For one cold second, his eyes stayed fixed. Then, with deliberate ease, he turned away as though the sight of me were something beneath him. The music swelled, guests clapped as someone raised a toast, but my ears rang. The entire ballroom sparkled with energy, a stage carefully set to honor Emily. For me, it was a reminder that I did not belong. I tried to steady my breathing, to remind myself that I had promised not to let them hurt me again. But even as I whispered those words inside, I felt it. There was a crack in the perfection, faint but sharp. It was in the way two guests near the bar glanced toward the door and murmured, in the way a server stumbled, eyes shifting to someone out of sight. I pressed my napkin into my lap, my pulse quickening. Something in the air was off, unstable, and I knew it would not take much for the glittering facade of this wedding to shatter. I sipped the water in front of me, the glass sweating against my fingers, and my mind drifted backward before I could stop it. 10 years earlier in 2012, I had stood on the stage at my college graduation, searching the crowd for my parents. My classmates were showered with flowers and hugs, mothers crying and fathers clapping proudly. I scanned the bleachers again and again, my cap crooked from the heat of the sun, but their seats were empty. Later I learned they had driven Emily across town for a commercial audition. That was the first time I understood what it meant to be invisible in my own family. The ache from that day never really faded. It grew heavier in 2018 when Carter & Sons, my father's construction company, teetered on the edge of collapse. I had offered to connect him with a nonprofit fund I knew through work. He barely looked up, his voice sharp and final. "You know nothing about business. Stay out of it." My words fell flat, and I carried them away like stones in my pocket. Emily, though, was always invited to sit in his office, even when she had nothing to contribute but charm. I had spent years burying that pattern, convincing myself it was just the way things were. My mother, Evelyn, used to lean close to relatives at family gatherings and whisper with pride, "Emily is the one who will lift us high again." I would stand a few feet away, pretending not to hear my smile fixed, as though I agreed. It was easier to nod than to fight. But each time something inside me bent a little further. Now sitting at this table, shoved against the service doors, the memories pressed against my chest. The chatter of the wedding around me blurred, replaced by those voices from the past. The neglect was not new. Tonight was just another stage, another display, another reminder that my place in this family was not at the center, but at the edges, watching. The flicker of candles at the other tables seemed to mock me, brighter and taller than the lonely flame at mine. Lucas leaned toward me, his hand warm on my arm. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. I nodded, though the word no trembled on my tongue. He squeezed once before leaning back, his presence steady, a quiet anchor in a storm that had not yet broken. The MC called for attention, asking guests to prepare for the bridal procession. Chairs scraped against the floor, voices hushed, and all eyes turned toward the grand entrance. I forced myself to sit straighter, to smooth the napkin across my lap, to appear calm. Inside, though, the weight of years of being forgotten pressed down like a heavy cloak. As the music swelled, I tried to remind myself to stay silent. I promised I would not let their cruelty steal this night from me. But the promise felt thin, fragile, like paper in the rain. Because as I looked at my family gathered at the head table, their laughter shining under the chandeliers, I realized nothing had changed. They had never changed. And the unease that lingered in the air earlier returned sharper now, tugging at my ribs, telling me something was coming. I lifted my glass again, the water warm and flat, and tried to swallow past the tightness in my throat. The applause began to rise as the first bridesmaid appeared at the doorway, and the sound rolled through the hall like a wave. I knew this night was only beginning, and I could feel the surface straining, ready to split. Something was about to break, and it would drag me with it. The music swelled, and the bridesmaids began to step into the aisle, when the ballroom doors at the back swung open, with a force that silenced the room. 3 men in dark suits strode in, their expressions hard, their presence so sharp it cut through the glow of chandeliers and the hum of conversation. They were strangers to me, but the way they moved told me they had come for something specific. The violinist faltered, the melody collapsing mid-phrase, and all eyes turned. One of the men stepped forward, his voice booming through the hall. "Richard Carter, you owe us $50,000. Pay it now, or everyone here will hear the truth." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Heads swiveled. The glittering facade cracked in an instant. Emily froze at the end of the aisle, her hand clutching her bouquet so tightly the petals bent. My mother, Evelyn, forced a smile, lifting her chin, as if she could wave the intruders away with poise. "There must be some mistake," she said quickly, her tone pitched too high. The man ignored her. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. My stomach clenched as he lifted them high, his voice even louder now. "This is not just a debt." He used his daughter's name to guarantee it. For a moment, the words did not register. Then they did, heavy and undeniable. My name echoed through the ballroom, bouncing off marble floors and crystal walls. The guests turned toward me in unison, hundreds of eyes drilling into my skin. My pulse thundered in my ears. Lucas's hand reached for mine under the table, but I barely felt it. The room tilted, the lights above blurring. I heard someone whisper, "Did she know?" Another voice muttered, "That poor girl." Emily's face drained of color, her lips parted but no sound came. Her bridesmaids shifted uneasily, their whispers quick and nervous. Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest, then turned sharply toward my father at the head table. Richard had gone rigid, his jaw locked, his eyes narrowed into a glare so cold it almost burned. He did not rise, did not speak, only stared at the men as though sheer force of will could erase them. The stranger held the papers higher. His eyes found mine, pinning me to my seat. "Olivia Carter, your name is here." The weight of it sent a chill down my spine. I could not breathe, could not move. My throat tightened, my vision swimming as the ballroom erupted in murmurs. Beside me, Lucas whispered my name steady and low, but it only made the humiliation sharper. I wanted to disappear, to vanish beneath the floor. Yet I could feel every stare pressing closer, judging, dissecting. My chair scraped against the polished wood as I shifted, the sound far too loud in the heavy silence. At the head table, Richard finally pushed himself to his feet, his hands braced against the linen, his voice sharp. "Enough." His tone cracked through the whispers, but did little to calm them. The man with the papers, whom I now recognized vaguely as Cole Maddox, an old associate of my father's company, did not flinch. "Pay what you owe, or they will all know what you did." The words hung in the air like smoke. I could see the confusion in the faces around me, curiosity battling with scandal. My cheeks burned. Every nerve in my body screamed to run, but my legs would not move. I thought of every time I had been told to stay silent, to endure, to let them control the story. And yet here it was unraveling without me lifting a finger. Emily took a shaky step back, her gown rustling, her bouquet trembling in her hands. Evelyn tried again, her voice almost breaking, insisting it was a misunderstanding. But the lie was too thin, now stretched past its breaking point. The weight of that stack of papers seemed to draw the entire room toward me. My name written there, tied to debts I had never agreed to, debts I had never even known existed. My heart pounded, as if it were trying to break free from my chest. I forced myself to lift my eyes, meeting Cole's steady gaze. I could see it in his expression, in the way his jaw tightened. This was only the beginning, and he was not finished. The silence before the next blow stretched unbearably long, and I knew the night had only just begun to unravel. My father suddenly pushed his chair back so hard it scraped across the marble floor. He stormed down the aisle between the tables, his tuxedo jacket flaring behind him, and shoved his hand toward Cole as if he could physically drag the man from the ballroom. Cole did not budge. Instead, he lifted his chin and shouted even louder, his voice booming over the string quartet that had gone silent. "Pay it right here in front of everyone." Phones lit up around the room as guests raised them, capturing every second. The glittering celebration had turned into a spectacle. My mother Evelyn darted forward, her heels clicking fast, her voice a sharp whisper in my ear. "Stay quiet. Let us handle this." Her hand squeezed my arm so hard it hurt. I wanted to shake her off, but my body felt heavy, frozen in my chair. Across the aisle, Emily stumbled toward me, the lace of her gown dragging across the floor. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they clutched mine. "Please," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Please do not make this worse. This is my day." Her words sliced through me. Not a word about the debt, not a glance of concern for me, only a plea to protect her image. I stared at her, seeing clearly what I had never wanted to admit. Her desperation was not for me, not for the truth, but for her wedding to remain flawless in front of these people. The weight of years of favoritism and dismissal pressed down, sharper than ever. Cole's eyes never left my father. With a sharp movement, he dropped the stack of papers onto the nearest table, the sound echoing like a gavel. The top page slid forward and stopped at the edge. I leaned in, my heart pounding, and saw my name written in neat black ink. Olivia Hartman listed as guarantor. My throat tightened. The handwriting was precise, not mine, yet too perfect to deny. The ballroom grew still, a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. I could hear the murmur of guests spreading like fire. Did she sign that? Poor girl. How could a father do this? My skin burned under the weight of every whisper. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself, the wood biting into my palms. I had never signed anything. I knew that as surely as I knew my own heartbeat. Yet here was my name tied to a debt that could ruin me. The humiliation poured over me in waves, but beneath it, something else sparked, small but fierce. Anger. For years I had been quiet, invisible, the scapegoat. Tonight the mask was slipping, and no matter how much they begged me to stay silent, the truth had already clawed its way into the light. Emily's grip on my hand tightened, but I pulled back, staring at her tearful face. Her lips trembled as she tried to whisper again, but I shook my head. My voice caught in my throat and would not come out. I could not protect her anymore, not at the cost of myself. My father snatched the papers from the table and shoved them against his chest as if he could hide them from the room. But it was too late. Guests leaned in closer, phones still raised, capturing every detail. The hush deepened, then broke into a fresh swell of whispers. The scene no longer belonged to him. It belonged to all of us who had watched the perfect facade crack wide open. My body trembled, but inside me a flame rose higher. They had dragged me into their mess without a word, without a choice. Now every secret was bleeding out into the open. I lifted my chin, refusing to drop my gaze, refusing to fold the way I always had. The murmur of voices swirled around me louder with every passing second. And in their echoes, I realized this was no longer about silence. Something larger was coming, something I had no power to stop, and it was barreling straight toward me. I reached for the stack of papers lying crooked on the table, my hands trembling so hard the pages rattled. The black ink blurred as I scanned the top sheet, but one line cut through everything. In 2019, Richard Carter agreed to a loan of $50,000 guaranteed by Olivia Hartman. My breath hitched. My name stared back at me, anchored beside his signature, binding me to a contract I had never seen. I flipped to the next page and the next, searching for an escape, but the words only tightened like a rope. At the back was an attachment, a list of collateral. I froze when I read it. Jewelry, 1 diamond necklace inherited. My grandmother's necklace, the one she promised to me, the one my mother told me had been damaged years ago and was worthless. The paper swam in front of my eyes. My stomach lurched as the memory of that lie came crashing back. Evelyn had smiled so easily when she told me it was gone. Now I understood. They had pawned it to cover his debts. A gasp broke through the crowd. Someone behind me whispered, "He used his daughter." Another voice answered, "Who does that to their own child?" The murmurs spread like a tide, rising in volume until it filled the hall. I could feel the shame pressing in from all sides, heavier than the weight of the contract in my hands. I looked up at my father. He stood rigid at the head table, his hands gripping the back of a chair. His face was pale, his lips trembling. "This is a misunderstanding," he stammered. "I will make this right." But his fingers betrayed him, tugging nervously at his tie, pulling at the knot until it sagged. The strong man who once towered over me with authority now looked small, brittle, cornered. I wanted to scream, to demand why he had chosen me, why he had tied my name to his failures, why my inheritance had been stolen to cover his mistakes. But the words stuck in my throat. I could not find my voice in the storm of whispers that surrounded us. Lucas reached for my arm, his steady grip grounding me, but it did little to calm the heat flooding my chest. My father had never seen me as more than a tool, something to use when convenient, something to discard when not. And now, before 200 witnesses, that truth lay bare. Cole stood firm in the center of the aisle, his eyes locked on Richard. He did not need to raise his voice again. The papers spoke louder than anything he could have said. My father looked around desperately, his gaze darting from one guest to another, but no one came to his defense. Even the men who had shaken his hand earlier now leaned back in their seats, their expressions cool and distant. Evelyn clutched Emily's arm, whispering frantically, but I could not hear the words. Emily's face was ashen, her bouquet dangling loosely in her hand, petals scattered at her feet. She looked at me with something between fear and blame, as if I had been the one to drag this mess into her wedding. I lowered the papers to the table, my vision still blurred but my mind sharper than it had been in years. I could feel anger rising through the humiliation, a fire that refused to be smothered. My father's lies had always hidden behind walls of silence, but tonight, those walls were crumbling. Guests continued to murmur, phones, lifted cameras catching every flicker of panic across my father's face. I clenched my fists until my nails dug into my palms, holding myself upright while the weight of betrayal pressed down. This was not just about debt or stolen jewelry. It was about years of being dismissed, of being nothing more than a shield for his mistakes. I looked at him one last time. His shoulders hunched, his voice faltered, his authority gone. For the first time, he seemed to realize he could not control what came next. The room belonged to the whispers now, and those whispers were about to turn into something louder, something impossible to silence. Hannah's heels clicked against the floor as she stepped out from the bridesmaid's line, her satin dress catching the light. Her voice sliced through the murmurs. Olivia always causes problems. I would not be surprised if she was involved in this. The words landed like a blade straight into my chest. For years she had been my closest friend, the one who once braided my hair before prom, the one who swore we would stand by each other. Now her betrayal hung in the air for everyone to hear. Gasps rippled across the room. Heads turned, and I felt the ground tilt beneath me. My mouth opened, but no words came. My sister Emily stumbled forward, clutching her bouquet, tears spilling down her cheeks. She collapsed into our mother's arms, sobbing loud enough for everyone to hear. "I just wanted today to be perfect. I just wanted one day without drama." Her voice cracked, painting herself as the victim. Guests rushed toward her, hands on her back, murmuring comfort. Poor bride ruined on her wedding day. The other half of the room whispered differently. I caught words that stung. How could a father sign his daughter's name? That girl had no idea. The tension split the crowd in two, sympathy drifting toward Emily, suspicion directed at me. I felt the divide like a knife separating bone from flesh. I knew if I stayed silent, the narrative would harden against me. I had seen it happen before when their lies became the truth, simply because I never fought back. My throat was dry, my pulse hammering, but I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. Lucas leaned closer, whispering, "Are you sure?" I nodded once, my hand trembling as I unlocked the screen. The room was still buzzing when I pressed play. A familiar voice filled the speakers, sharp and unmistakable. "If anyone asks, just blame Olivia. She is used to taking the fall." Gasps swept the hall. Some guests froze mid-step, others turned sharply toward my mother. Evelyn's face went pale, her hand slipping from Emily's back. The voicemail echoed through the chandeliers, bouncing off marble and glass. My body shook, but this time not from shame. From release. From fury. For the first time in years, the truth was not buried inside me. It was out here, undeniable, carved into the air for everyone to hear. I lifted my eyes and met Evelyn's gaze across the room. Her lips parted as if she might deny it, but no words came. Her eyes flicked to the phones raised around us, recording, capturing, leaving her no escape. Emily's sobs faltered. Hannah's face drained of color. Guests who had pitied the bride now stared at my mother with shock and disgust. The whispers grew louder, no longer about me, but about them. "Did you hear that? She told them to blame her own daughter." My father shifted in his chair, tugging at his collar, his jaw clenched. The cracks in their carefully built facade were widening, the truth pouring through faster than they could patch it. I stood taller, the phone still in my hand, my pulse racing. For years I had been the scapegoat, the shadow, the one who swallowed their lies. Tonight the mask was ripped away. No one could unhear that voice. The guests surged with noise again, this time sharper, angrier. The tide had turned. Yet I could see in my father's eyes a storm, gathering, something more dangerous than silence, something about to explode in front of everyone. My father shoved his chair back with such force it nearly toppled his face, twisted with rage. His voice thundered through the ballroom, breaking over the crowd. "Enough of this!" His words shook, but his volume only made the cracks in him more obvious. Cole did not flinch. He stepped forward, his finger stabbing at the contract still lying open on the table. "This is a forgery," he declared, his tone steady, commanding. "Olivia never signed it." The guests erupted again, a wave of voices spilling across the hall. Fraud. Larceny. How could he? Phones lifted higher, their red recording lights glowing like unblinking eyes. My mother clutched Emily's arm, her lips moving fast, whispering frantic excuses to anyone close enough to hear. Emily sobbed harder, burying her face in her bouquet petals, scattering to the floor. Richard's face flushed crimson. His tie hung loose, his tuxedo jacket open, the proud image he had crafted unraveling thread by thread. He pointed at me, his hand shaking. "Stop this, Olivia. You are destroying everything. You always destroy everything." His words cracked in the air, raw and broken, exposing not strength, but desperation. The room shifted. A man in a navy suit, one of the city's respected developers, rose slowly from his chair. His voice was low, but carried in the stunned silence. "Carter and Sons is finished." Heads turned, nods followed, and the whisper of agreement spread quickly. I stood frozen, my phone still in my hand, my chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. For once I had no need to argue, no need to shout. The truth was already alive in the room, spoken by others, not by me. Every denial from my father, every glare from my mother, only deepened the verdict that had already been cast. Cole laid the papers flat, his hand firm on the table, and turned to face the guests. "You have all seen what this family tried to hide. There is no mistake here. The evidence is in front of you." His calmness sliced sharper than any shout. Richard's shoulders sagged, but his mouth kept moving, words spilling uncontrolled. "Lies. All of it. She planned this." He jabbed a finger toward me again, his voice hoarse. "She has always wanted to ruin us." But no one reacted this time. His accusations hung in the air like smoke with no fire behind it. The judge and jury were already seated, and every guest who stayed in every phone capturing his collapse. The chandeliers glittered overhead, but the glamour was gone. The ballroom had become a courtroom, and my father was the defendant, my mother, his silent accomplice, my sister, the failed distraction. I lifted my chin, my eyes sweeping across the faces staring back. Strangers, friends of my parents, business partners, neighbors. They were no longer watching a wedding. They were witnessing a reckoning. And though my body shook, though humiliation still burned under my skin, I felt something shift inside me. For once, I was not powerless. My father slammed his fist against the table, his last attempt at control, but the sound was drowned out by the tide of whispers turning into judgment. His image was broken, his authority gone. And I knew the storm was not over yet, because storms this violent always leave destruction in their wake. Emily's bouquet slipped from her hands as she ran her veil, tearing loose her white gown, dragging across the floor and gathering dust and wine stains. The sound of her sobs faded down the corridor, leaving only the heavy silence of 200 stunned guests. My mother Evelyn sat rigid in her chair, her face drained of color, her pearls crooked at her throat. She did not lift her eyes, did not dare to speak. She had built her life around appearances, and now those appearances had cracked into rubble at her feet. My father Richard leaned over the table where Cole had left the contract. His hands trembled as he gathered the pages. His voice lowered now, a hoarse whisper meant only for Cole. They moved a few feet away, heads bent in harsh murmurs. Guests did not follow. They only watched, arms crossed. Phones still raised, gazes sharp with contempt. The mighty Richard Carter reduced to bargaining with a man he once dismissed. One by one the guests slipped away. Some shook their heads, others muttered under their breath. A few glanced at me with pity, but most avoided my eyes. Their laughter and toasts had filled this room an hour earlier. Now the grand chandeliers glowed coldly above rows of empty chairs and half-finished glasses of champagne. The Rosewood Manor, once roaring with music, had fallen into the hush of a courtroom after the gavel. I stood my legs unsteady and felt Lucas's arm steady me. Maggie appeared at my side, her coat draped over one arm, her expression clear and focused. She leaned close, her voice calm. "Olivia, this is forgery. They used your name without consent. We can take them to court." Her words sank into me heavy but steadying. For so long I had been told to endure, to stay silent, to bear it. Now the path was different. I stepped toward the tall windows at the side of the hall. Beyond them, the Boston night stretched wide, the sky gray and heavy, the city lights flickering like restless stars. The glass was cold beneath my palm. I thought of my grandmother's necklace, the one meant for me, pawned without a word. I thought of every graduation, every family gathering, every time my name had been twisted into a shield for their failings. Tonight had ended that silence. Richard's voice rose once more behind me, but it was not the booming authority of earlier. It was low-strained, a man pleading for terms. Cole's answer came in clipped syllables, sharp enough to cut. I did not need to hear more. Whatever was decided at that table would never change the truth already exposed. I drew a long breath, filling my lungs with air that tasted almost clean. For the first time, the weight pressing on my shoulders seemed lighter. Lucas slipped his hand into mine, his warmth grounding me, and Maggie gave a small nod. We walked toward the doors, the echo of our footsteps following us out into the cool night. Outside, the air was brisk, the streets damp from an earlier rain. I lifted my head to the courthouse spire glowing in the distance. My reflection in the glass doors no longer looked like a shadow, but like someone standing upright, unbroken. Justice does not need to shout. It only needs the truth. For years I had been the forgotten daughter, the scapegoat, the silent witness. Tonight I stepped out of their shadow. Tonight I began again. And to anyone who has ever been betrayed by the ones meant to protect you, to anyone who has ever carried blame that was never yours, remember this. The truth always finds its way into the light. If you believe that, share it. Tell me what justice means to you and stay with me, because this story is only the beginning.